Yeah, good morning, everybody. It's so nice to see everybody. I hope everybody had a really wonderful weekend. Um, I think this week will be a little bit light in terms of the content, and I'd love to kind of start to shift over to just giving more space for people to actually just meet each other, talk, and actually share more about the different bioregional maps, bioregional frameworks, bioregions that people are coming from, and what people are finding useful. So it's really nice to see everybody, and hopefully we'll have a couple different opportunities to kind of dive in. And towards the end, I'd also love to invite the opportunity for people to share about the bioregions they call home and that they're coming from. And that can be either through the Excel sheets, or not the Excel, the Google slides that people have created, or just, if people want to show us images through Google searches or with maps or other resources that, people have created. I think we just love to invite the opportunity to see a little bit of the diversity and spread of where people are coming from and what people kind of taking away. And give me just a moment. I thought I would start this morning off just with a quote by Robin Wall Kimmerer. This will be an excerpt from a chapter called Learning the Grammar of Intimacy. To be native to a place, we must learn to speak its language. I come here to listen, nestle in the curve of the roots in a soft hollow of pine needles, to lean my bones against the column of white pine, to turn off the voice in my head until I can hear the voices outside it, the shh of wind and needles, water trickling over rock, nuthatch tapping, chipmunks digging, beech nuts falling, mosquito in my ear, and something more. Something that is not me, for which we have no language, the wordless being of others in which we are never alone. After the drumbeat of my mother's heart, this was my first language. I could spend a whole day listening and a whole night, and in the morning, without my hearing it, there might be a mushroom that was not there the night before, creamy white, pushed up from the pine needle duff, out of the darkness to light, still glistening with the fluid of its passage. Puh, oh-ee. Listening in wild places, we are audience to conversations in a language not our own. I think now that it was a longing to comprehend this language I hear in the woods that led me to science, to learn over the years to speak fluent botany, a tongue that should not, by the way, be mistaken for the language of plants. I did learn another language in science, though, one of careful observation, an intimate vocabulary that names each little part. To name and describe, you must first see, and science polishes the gift of seeing. I honor the strength of the language that has become a second tongue to me. But beneath the richness of its vocabulary and its descriptive power, something is missing, the same something that swells around you and in you when you listen to the world. Science can be a language of distance, which reduces a being to its working parts. It is a language of objects. The language scientists speak, however precise, is based on a profound error in grammar, an omission, a grave loss in translation from the native languages of these shores. My first taste of the missing language was the word huh, hoey on my tongue. I stumbled on it in a book by the Anishinaabe ethnobotanist Kiwe Dinque, in a treatise on the traditional uses of fungi by our people. Puhpoe, she explained, translates as the force which causes mushrooms to push up from the earth overnight. As a biologist, I was stunned that such a word existed. In all its technical vocabulary, Western science has no such term, no words to hold this mystery. You'd think that biologists, of all people, would have words for life, but in scientific language, our terminology is used to define the boundaries of our knowing. What lies beyond our grasp remained unnamed. In the three syllables of this new word, I could see an entire process of close observation in the damp morning woods, the formulation of a theory for which English has no equivalent. The makers of this word understood a world of being, full of unseen energies that animate everything. I've cherished it for many years as a talisman and longed for the people who gave a name to the life force of mushrooms. And that was an excerpt from the chapter called Learning the Grammar of Intimacy. I just thought that that would be really a nice way to start, kind of talking about indigenous wisdom, scientific knowledge, and the teaching of plants. I just kind of also threw in, speaking of mycelium, this is a really nice example of someone shared this Fumu map that's being created by the Bioregional Weaving Labs. That's really helping highlight that the bioregional movement is on the rise and then starting to list some of these great bioregional organizations, movements, and groups. And so I thought I would share this here. You can find this Kumu map on the Bioregional Weaving Labs collective website, and it's kind of neat. And then just lastly, so Michelle, I saw you on the call, and I was wondering if you had any interest in talking about this wonderful watershed definition that you shared. And you don't have to if it's putting you on the spot.
No, no, no. I'm okay with that. Um, yeah, I think what happened is I really like the word watershed because I am more of an English and history buff than you know, the science part. And I always thought of watershed as being that wonderful turning point, that everything is different because of the watershed, right? Which would be in a novel or history. And of course, one of the discussions we talked about the actual definition, and it seemed it was all about water shedding off the land and moving and whatever. So yeah, so I didn't really like that very much. So yeah, so I kind of decided that it needed to be a story about the water cycle, but in definitions you're not allowed to say the word water, right? So yeah, so that's why I worked on the definition and tried to talk about the story and why it was like a turning point, not just water shedding off the land. So yeah, thank you.
I love that. And I think I love that you brought in I think the story of the word. And I really love that, kind of these original definitions that you've got. I think the National Ocean Service that, it's just a land area that channels rainfall and snowmelt to creeks, streams, and rivers, and eventually to outflow points. But that then you've also brought in that an event or period that is important because it represents a big change in how people do or think about something. And so I love combining that together into this story, that we need both of those working together right now at this moment of time. So thanks for sharing. That's great. And with that, I just thought that maybe we could start today by um, getting into a few different small breakout groups and then looking at what are some of the uses of creating bioregional maps and maps of bioregions. And I think that this can be both a large question in terms of, what's missing in terms of science and maps and other things. But I'm also very curious about you personally, for yourself, for how you relate to where you live, or if you're part of a group, part of the design school. How are you viewing these bioregional maps, and what are you seeing as kind of yeah, what are you seeing as some outcomes that could come from it? And how has this class kind of or workshops, how has this changed our thinking about it or not? And what are some of the most valuable things that you're seeing? So um, maybe we could throw this question up in the chat window real quick, and then we can just say break into we'll just do I'll assign breakout groups, and I figure we can just talk about this for about 10 minutes. um, Not, low stress, don't worry overly about it, and then we can come back and have a group conversation after that. All right. And so we'll go for about 10 minutes and would love to hear what you all talk about. Yeah, so welcome back, everybody. I would love to just maybe invite some time for reflection on what did your groups talk about, or what were some of the things that got brought up? I'd love to invite any different members from different groups to share.
Hi, Brendan. Well, our group,
Peter.
I mean, my takeaway from our group is that there is so many ways of looking at the maps, and also the motivation as to where and how to look at them. Of course, it depends on the region where you are, and some of the watersheds is more aquifer based and much more into the soil and the deepening of the landscape instead of the rivers and all the other water flows. So it was a great insight, coming from different regions, different perspectives, different motivations. So that's my takeaway from our group.
What were some of the different takeaways that you found most inspiring or interesting?
Um, we had one, which was a Christian from Scandinavia, and he was working on maps to become more involved and more hands-on, working with maps and more creative. Um, we had Jack in Colombia, as I understand, working on basically using the mapping towards the yeah, also helping supporting the region. And then we had Will, who was very much, let's say, in a completely different way of looking at what. So maybe they can add to this, but let's say different perspectives, different ways of looking at it, and also, what is going on was a main question. What is everybody doing? What
That's
is already
great.
happening? And there's so much going on. So it's quite daunting to keep up, if you will.
Okay, so that's wonderful. So lots going on and trying to not to be overwhelmed. Marie Angel.
Yeah, in our group, I talked about the fact that water management, especially drought proofing, and the importance of actually having data about what's happening in almost every field, because it creates so much difference to how the soil and the water interact, and therefore how the watershed health is going to be. And that is just a very recent realization. And then also that in relation to getting money for research and development, it was really important to be able to be convincing with data. Another person came up with the importance of John Wynne, the importance of creating a common language, commonality of purpose and a common language. Ricardo talked about resurrecting ancient cultures, well, not that ancient, pre-Columbian cultures 150 years ago, before the Spaniards came and basically erased the whole governance and control system from the area. And then there was another chap, I can't remember his name now, who was talking about the importance of maps in order to make exchanges with other areas in a digital way through conferences, so that they could compare notes with maps. So that's what I understood.
That's wonderful. Joan.
We had a really great conversation about a number of things that mapping can, communicate a bunch of different things, but the idea that it can help make connections and dissolve political boundaries. I really thought that was the bioregional mapping is a way to create connections. Alias really can speak to this very eloquently. But then we got into talking about ways of indigenous mapping that I think I would really like to look into more too. So there was a really rich discussion. Thanks.
That's wonderful. And yeah, I think the Mediterranean is one of the probably most exciting and cool examples currently of redefining how we look at these shared ecosystems and cultures that have grown for thousands of years, but then have now been really cut up and divided. And then especially, I think what's really cool is, yeah, so that you have the breaking down the borders, but then also looking at these traditional indigenous ways of looking at maps. Karen.
Yeah, I wanted to share this past week I attended Wisconsin Women in Conservation, a group of people who are interested in soil health and soil conservation districts. And soil conservation districts in the United States are organized, by county, which are, not ideal in terms of bioregioning, but certainly create a framework for talking about river catchments, and as we're talking about in the chat here. And so I find that the people who are talking about soil health are particularly, it's a fertile opportunity for having courageous conversations in the very purple kinds of counties in Wisconsin. Now there's also a spinoff in Minnesota Women in Conservation and Iowa Women in Conservation. And so I'm feeling really hopeful about, and I should say these are gender inclusive spaces. No one checked what's in my underpants to include or exclude me from being in these spaces. So there are certainly, men and involved in these conversations, but there's something kind of something that came out in these conversations too, is this idea of ownership. Oh, what I meant by purple county, yes, a blend of red and blue, like people in rural counties, many of them may be using conventional agriculture or have a Trump sign in their yard kind of thing. And right next to them is someone who bought a homestead that they are trying to put into conservation easement, or figuring out how to make it owned by the Menominee Nation, the Native American reservation closest to them, kind of, or who were the historical caretakers of that space. So I think women are uniquely positioned for having conversations that transcend the concept of ownership. Many of these women, maybe they and their husband own their farm, so to speak, but they didn't even really think of themselves as being an owner or having an equal say. And sometimes people don't see women and what they have to say as being, you know, scientifically valid or worth listening to. And so there can be some of these, you know, barriers even within the intra communication between a wife and her husband, for example, or a daughter and her father, and getting to the place where they're talking about, you know, well, what would it look like if we use some of these soil conservation ideas, which are often, you know, complementary to the watershed, as Maria Angela Savi just said. Yes, and women are the water bearers of life.
Wow, yeah. I love you just brought in so much to this conversation, and I think that really highlights why all of this is so important. And also, I just want to say I love the wood cut, of this layered Great Lakes map of your background. I think that's also great. But in terms of what you're bringing up, I mean, how I think it's such a wonderful example of how we can shift these conversations from these single silos into these whole lens, whole landscape, whole watershed approaches, and using things like soil and you know, water, soil, just health as ways to engage conversations with our neighbors. And this beautiful thing of like, actually, when we're talking about bioregional, when we share a land base, we have a common language, we have a common uh, shared concerns and values and a shared future that we all need to talk about. And so if our water is dirty, it doesn't matter whether you're right or left. That affects all of us. If there's wildfires or droughts or smoke seasons, if you're living in a place, yeah, these arbitrary lines and boundaries and borders really stop mattering. And I think what's really interesting about what you're talking about too is I actually think these windows and corridors where you have this private land ownership um, can both be one of these barriers because we think of things in private ownership, but it's also one of our greatest opportunities for making change because it's just the decision of people coming together. And when we're talking about resilience and watershed health, and there are ways to approach that when you talk about compost or invasive species in a river, which can actually be very game changing and defining. And a lot of these conversations, and again, language is very powerful. I think we have a lot of coded language in how we talk that paints us as left or urban or rural or right or whatever. But what's great about compost and invasive species and other things is it kind of gives us a window. Same thing with disaster management, resilience, energy, food, homesteading, right? That it actually gives us a window into a lot of these conversations. So I just thought that was really great. And I've also seen a lot of success. It's been really interesting with like the Nisqually River here or some of these other watersheds where they've done really cool intergenerational programs working with schools and kids. And Joe talks about this a lot of like the role of youth in and kind of creating healing in communities. Um, but when you start getting science programs that maybe go out and start doing water sampling to test water quality for agricultural runoff, and you start getting kids passionate about it, they're one of the best ways to kind of get in to talk to the parents as well. And so I don't know, there's just that's a really cool point. Yeah, so before we move on, I'm just curious if anybody else has anything else coming up for them or that they'd like to share. All right. And yes, Mish, I will talk about that towards the end. But also just feel free to reach out to me anytime. Fine. Yeah, so with that, or sorry, did you have one other thing, Karen?
Oh, well, I just saw David's question about urban settings, and I'm set in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. My sister and I wrote a book called Easy Walks and Paddles in Milwaukee, and we researched, the riverways and all of the put-ins for paddles. And we talked about the public spaces and accessibility in particular. And I will be I just had a conversation with UWM. They have a field school in the summertime to talk about the urban gardens and resiliency and the built environment. And I'm going to do some kind of walk and talk, park walk and talks is sort of what I've been setting up with different organizations in the city, the League of Women Voters for Milwaukee County, like I said, the River Keeper, Plastic Free Milwaukee. And the way I'm kind of deciding which organizations to partner with is anything about your organization related to the permaculture principles? Can you tell me one single story about how you are working towards integrating, or you value diversity, or you're striving towards zero waste or something? Is there something that your organization is doing that is pro-social? Because I also need to sort of have a filter. I don't really want to map everything in the community if it's, doesn't seem to be fulfilling a pro-social function. I don't, I don't know that I need to spend energy networking in with that. Now my cat is taking up. I want something to say.
That's great. Emanuela.
Yeah, hi, Brandon. Actually, I love those breakout because randomly in our group, I was talking about how much fun I have with bioregional mapping because I'm imagining the way indigenous people used to orient themselves. It's fun for me to pretend that I am 500 years ago looking into a map, orienting myself. And then I shared that, and Jody, who is here, mentioned that she had taken a class just about that, indigenous mapping, in a regenerative course that she just finished. So we're going to speak and maybe see if there's something that could be brought in, It could be interesting to imagine, to know how they were moving and planning, That's it.
I think as you have those conversations, please feel free to share any of those resources in the Bioregional Mapping Guild space. There are so many cool examples from Indigenous mapping to also then now Indigenous reclamation of mapping. And so anything you'd like to share in that, I think would be wonderful. Great. Yeah, so for this next section, I'd love to just kind of share a little bit about what are some of the things, and I'll just kind of talk from a personal perspective of what I've seen in the last couple of years of some of the conversations that we've been having around the uses of bioregional mapping as a really critical first step as part of a broader story of place and shared story of bioregionalism that we're all creating together. I might just start by talking about the design school. What's really exciting is the design school for Regenerating Earth is only about 2 years old. And within that, it has grown and it has continued to grow, and it is seeing this exponential growth curve as people are really leaning in to bioregionalism. And more than that, where people are actually like really burning out, I think, of our traditional systems. And no matter, I think, where people are, they're really looking for these alternatives. And so what I think is really wonderful is the Design School for Regenerating Earth has the potential to become just a wonderful platform, along with many other platforms that people are growing and building and networks, where people are starting to have these very real conversations of what are alternatives to the nation state? What are alternatives to capitalism and extractive economies? And or just at its very base minimum, what are some ways of looking at where we live that are healthier and healthier for the place, healthier for helping us heal our relationships? There's a lot of conversations about if we're talking about extractive ways of living, then how do we start to heal that into these more regenerative, non-extractive ways of living within place and understanding where we live that can actually be healing and seeing humans put into their ecosystems as a keystone species. That yes, we can have a negative impact and are currently having a negative impact, but we can also have an incredibly positive impact too, if we actually shift and start to think about it in that way. I want to just bring in these next couple slides are from, I'm currently taking what is it? The BioFi Cultivator with Samantha Powers, and with several other different bioregions and bioregional organizing teams and leadership teams from around the world that they've identified, that are really starting to look at this kind of wholesale transition. And I think one of the really exciting things that I just wanted to name, and this is also, I think, one of the core purposes of what we're looking at in the design school, is how are we starting to form bioregional organizing teams and leadership teams? How are we defining our bioregions and bioregional frameworks from which we live? You know, what are the landscapes that we're looking at? How are we approaching these landscapes in a fundamentally different way rather than issue by issue, topic by topic, silo by silo? No, we're actually threading and weaving all of these different initiatives or projects or regenerative things in a place together and providing that really that interstitial core capacity building and support, that can kind of help a bioregion visualize itself to itself, right? Who are the people doing the regenerative work? How do we see them empowered? How do we visualize and support that work and then thread it all together and then using these nested scales, to come together more broadly around the world, from local to bioregional to global. And a big part of this through the design school, through other different communities, is for people to start to meet with other people in their places, find other people who are interested in doing this work and starting to create these bioregional leadership teams. And I really love this quote by Nora Bateson, which is, whatever leadership used to be, it used to be. Now it has to be something different. Now we all have to be more than we were. As our systems begin to fray in this unraveling time, reorganization is necessary. Who will lead the way? Who are the experts at being in the liminal space? Of course, the answer is all of us. And just to kind of talk about these broader shared strategies that we're building, this all starts, no matter where you go, it starts with a story of place and bioregional mapping. That's going to be step one, whether you're building a local landscape group, whether you're trying to figure out what bioregion you are, whether you're just starting, whether you're already with a great active group of people. And really, that's because there's just a lot of learning and unlearning that needs to happen. There's just a lot of just our society has spent 400 years carving and dividing things up into little boxes and smaller pieces of territories. And so we actually have to do the work to undo that, to unlearn that, and then to create our own maps and resources. But what's exciting is once we do that, we can all walk through a similar process. And that process is helping us, once we have this story of place, building the bioregional maps, starting to do asset and risk mapping, both for the bioregion as well as regenerative people in the landscape who are doing it. It means that we can start to come together to build visions. And when we start to create these bioregional visions, it's what does a regenerative future actually look like for our places? That could be an island that I live on. It could be the Salish Sea. It could be the Cascadia bioregion. It could be for a creek or a watershed. But again, what it means is that we're inviting everybody impacted, everybody who lives in this place, with all of the organizations, all the businesses, to come together and actually talk about what does a regenerative future for a place look like. And once we have that future and that vision, we can actually use it as a roadmap. How can we talk about a regenerative future or vision to a policymaker if we don't even know it for ourselves? And so for example, if you're talking about Vashon Island, what happens when you invite a land trust together with a solar energy company, with an affordable housing organization, to start talking about how people could start living in place? The islands, have a tremendous amount of pressure with housing population growth. So now with the land trust and affordable housing, you could be talking about how are we building in place in a way that's regenerative and not destructive and not just parceling out land. And then you could partner it with the solar power energy company. And now you're talking about off grid. And then you could be hooking it in with permaculture groups. And then you could, so that we're actually growing our own food and to increase our resilience. And then you could be hooking it in with, all sorts of different things that kind of help build the resilience of that place. From that vision, a big part of what we're talking about is starting to think about creating bioregional regeneration strategies. And that's how do we get from where we are today to that future vision, 500 years down the road, where we have an actual regenerative future, where we're living as a part of the places that we're living, or part of the places not being extractive. And then what you'll see is that in the design school and around the, I don't know, in different networks and communities, there is a tremendous amount of people talking about how do we fund and support this work. And I think that those first 4 or 5 steps are really important in setting the grassroots organizers and the frameworks that we need, that then we can start to build bioregional financing facilities and funding ecosystems. And so that's really now about how are we creating funding flows. And sometimes it's going to be philanthropic, but it's also about how are we creating regenerative businesses? How are we supporting people out there who are already doing the work? And how are we growing the capacity for more people to do that as well? And then how are we networking them all together? And that's what you'll see. You'll see a lot of people. You see Samantha Powers talking about this. You'll see Joe talking about this. And again, how are we hooking it all into a nested scale of bioregional regeneration? And I think one of the most important things is to just, as we talk about that, is this also means that we're creating a narrative. We're creating a shared story. This is both a story of place for where we live, but it's also the story of bioregionalism. It's the story of the bioregional movement that we are growing together. And by being a part of the Design School for Regenerating Earth, for doing regenerative and bioregional work in your communities, you are stepping into the story. And so how we are stepping into the story is just as important as the story itself. And it's the process that we're inviting people into. And that means coming in right relationship. It means having that shared North Star and shared values and principles. And if we have that, we can all be taking action in our own bioregions, our own landscapes together, but also coming in support of each other, because we need to be doing it collaboratively. And we need to be shifting our frameworks from these kind of tired old ways of doing it where it's competitive. We got to, it's a scarcity mindset, and we need to get out of that. And we need to shift to one of abundance. A big part of this shift is shifting from ego to eco, right? So really taking that eco-systemic approach. This isn't just about any one little organization or group working on its own. It's rather, how are we weaving an entire ecosystem and coming in support of it? How are we building that mycelium, the mycorrhizal roots, the fungus underground that connects the roots together so that these large old growth trees can blossom and be pillars of support for the communities that we're building, and the support that our watersheds and inhabitants and ecosystems need. From this web of stories and relationships, then we can start to grow these bioregional funding ecosystems. And this is coordinated, it's learning, it's unlearning, and it's weaving together these tapestries of local efforts. I brought up the issue of, if we looked at Vashon Island and a land trust coming together with an affordable housing, coming together with a solar company, coming together with a permaculture farm, how much more powerful is it when all of those groups work together and weave their work together for that shared vision and start applying for grants? So not one organization together, one by itself, but rather, what if you had 10 organizations, 15 organizations, 20 organizations who have already done the work of creating their vision of the future, their bioregional regeneration strategy, and starting to think about a budget. What would it actually cost to regenerate the places where we live? It could be our watershed, it could be our ecoregions, our ecosystems, it could be our bioregions, but right now we don't even know. And so if people tried to flow money in, who are the people doing the work? We don't have those directories. And so that's where we get to start to weave together these relationships and think about things as an ecosystem. So what are the things that we need for this movement, for our ecosystems to thrive? What kind of businesses would that mean? What type of cooperatives would it be? What type of nonprofits, currently don't exist? What are the economic and political institutions that we need, that we currently don't have or that are failing us, right? So how can we start to build that in? What are the types of local civic assets? Can we be passing city ordinances or getting bonds to fund regenerative work in our areas? And then how are we coordinating this all together so that we each have our special niches, but it's all stronger together. I think I just wanted to share this as a beautiful example. This is an image from the 7th Generation Legacy Project in the Greater Takaranto bioregion, one of the many different groups working throughout the Great Lakes. But I love that they really done a beautiful job of incorporating this nested scale of land, community, bioregions, the Great Lakes, the planet, and what are all the different things that they're trying to weave together, environment, community, economy, intergenerational life course, aging, indigenous ways of knowing, lifelong learning, and then how do we actually make it happen? And then with that, they've used these beautiful bioregional maps of the Oak Ridge Moraine. So even starting back in the 90s, this is another one of these beautiful groups that grew out of these early bioregional congresses. And even in the 80s and 90s, they had several people pick up this idea of what is the Oak Ridge Moraine bioregion for that very unique ecosystem. And how does that kind of surround the Greater Toronto area? And so from this grew this idea of the Greater Takaranto bioregion. And over the last 20 years, it's kind of grown and they've kind of built it in. And now they've started to weave all the groups in this area together. And so again, and they've done these kind of beautiful jobs with building education programs where they're pairing elders with youth and high school environmental groups. They're bringing together regenerative farms and building the directories. They're working with the different eco districts and watershed conservation districts to start to invite them to come together and start talking together, because they're all siloed and none of them were actually working together. And once they have all of these people working together, they're inviting them to come together with funders to actually start to talk about how do they create a holistic watershed or landscape scale plan for starting to restore this area. How are they integrating a shared approach around building a green belt and then protecting these waterways and ecosystems, and as part of this broader Great Lakes area. I just also add that one of the most important things about us creating our own bioregional maps is also us determining the things that are important and special for us to map and to track and to make sure it's improving. Because if we don't add it to the map, no one else is going to do it for us. And we're the ones who know what's special. And then the only other thing that I would add that's really cool is when we create these bioregional frameworks, we also create a framework which can break a lot of these really scary, intangible global issues down to a local level. And when we do that, we can actually say, every year, are we being successful? And we can actually have definable metrics for success, and we can be tracking our impact. So as we're weaving all the groups together, as we're creating the regeneration strategies and the plans and money starting to flow, we can actually look at, are we being successful? And if we're not, we can evaluate and reevaluate and start to think about that. I'll also just add and give a little shout out to one of the people who's really looking at this is Bill Bowie, and he's been doing a series of presentations in the design school in partnership with, and is doing a lot of work with R3.0, their organization. And if you're interested in learning more, I think you can find all of his existing presentations on bioregional carrying capacity, context-based indicators, actually in the design school in the partnership area. So definitely give that a check out if you're interested in learning more. And with that, we can also be talking about what are these different planetary thresholds that are going up, and then how is it being impacted in our local areas. I just want to talk for a moment and just reinforce this idea that just like creating our own maps, creating our own definitions for measurement, reporting, verification, bioregional carrying capacity, context-based indicators is probably one of the most important things that we can do. Maybe we want to measure happiness. Maybe we want to measure biodiversity. Maybe we want to measure salmon. Maybe we want to measure the amount of regenerative farms in the place that we're living. It's up to you to figure out what those metrics are. And every place it's going to be different. And it's really important that we have those. I was just having a conversation with this group. This is being done by Refi, I think Sicily, in a really cool group in the Mediterranean. But they're partnering with this group Sylvie, which is an online platform to connect funders who want to invest in like green economy and get carbon offsets as part of the carbon offset market. They connect them to people planting trees. And that's really cool. You know, it is cool to support people planting trees. But when I was talking to them, right, like their mission is helping 1 billion people plant 1 trillion trees. But then when I was asked, you know, like, and so I just had a meeting with like some people working with Sylvie the other day, and I was asking them, like, that's really great. You're paying people to plant trees, but what support mechanisms do you have for biodiversity or protecting trees that are already there, right? Like old growth trees or mature forests or whatever. And they're like, oh, well, we haven't thought about that yet, but we can definitely change the methodology. Oh, yeah, it's a great idea. You know, we could have a methodology and then people support it. And so you need to be careful because now all of a sudden, like what you've done is create a system that incentivizes people to plant trees, but with no protection about cutting down trees. And so now we have a carbon capture market where people are getting paid to plant trees, but could also get paid to cut down trees. And now is that actually leading to a regenerative future? I think that's, you know, and that's why just I think always being really critical, not destructively, because what's nice is now we're having a conversation about actually building in a different methodology so that they can change that. But I think it's really important that as we go into these spaces, keep your eyes open and really like cut through the bullshit. It's kind of up to us to do that and to hold people accountable, and then to make sure that they're actually reflecting our values and actually leading to a regenerative future. Because a lot of people have the best intentions, but they can become very abstracted or disconnected from place. So as a counter to that, I just also want to share with you this really cool group, which is here locally in Cascadia. It's called Quaxala. This is a indigenous-led biocultural program, very similar in that they are trying to figure out a way for people to invest in living forests and to protect it, to regenerate it, as a counter to logging on government lands in British Columbia. And to do this, for their methodology, they've created something called the Century Ledger, where because they quickly figured out that when people are talking about forest land, if you're just talking about timber or carbon, you're missing something. If you're just talking about trees being planted, you're missing something. And so the Century Ledger, instead of just like number of trees per acre or something, is looking at how many 100-year-old trees. And actually now it's gotten a lot more complicated because they really wanted to take in these other accounts of soil health and biodiversity. But it started with just that very simple premise of using a century ledger to measure the health of 1 acre of forest. And so by a century ledger, it just means the number of centuries of age in a specific area, with the idea that that can give you a pretty good I don't know, cue in of the biodiversity and ecological health of a specific area. And so if you had 10 seedlings, you know, or maybe like, you know, 100 1-year-old trees would equal a century. 10 10-year-old trees would equal a century, or 1 old growth tree might have 10 centuries because it's 1,000 years old. And so each of these help us better determine how we might be talking about the health of an area. And it's why us creating our own methodologies and these things about what's important to map and then what's important to track after we've mapped it. And how are we doing that? And how are we then holding our governments, our policy officials, businesses accountable? And how are we providing better pathways to actually help people protect and regenerate the places that we live becomes very important. Here's another beautiful example. This is called Hidden Hydrologies. And this is a really cool art project in Vancouver. And so I just love these bioregional maps and community art give us the opportunity to really name the things being left off of traditional maps. And so this project in Vancouver is a public art program that helps people do these beautiful art on roadways to show where the river was. Where's the watershed that has now been paved over? And once we visualize it, once we know it's there, once people know it's there, now we've created a framework where we might be able to take action and where people are educated about something that they might not have been in the past. And all to say that one of those big things that I think we talked about this a lot last year, but then is once we have all of this information being held, we have bioregional organizing teams, we have bioregional regeneration strategies, we have all of these layers that we find important. And that's that every different bioregion or every different watershed even should start to think about and develop this idea of a bioregional learning center. And this was first promoted by Donella Meadows back in the 70s and 80s. And it's the idea that these bioregional learning centers and resource hubs hold the story of that place. They help hold that interstitial core capacity that can weave groups together on the scale of an island, of a watershed, of an ecosystem, of a bioregion, and that can really be centering and supporting these efforts, and that there might be many, just like there might be many different bioregional learning sites where people actually go get their hands dirty, learn about permaculture, learn about these principles, and learn about those unique ways of living in place. Once we have all this information, what's really exciting is now with shape files, for example, or these other things, we can start to build these bioregional atlases. And we can look at these different layers and we can map them and we can create them, and they become useful for each of us. And lastly, I'll just touch on something I think that we should all think about is as we create these bioregional organizing teams, as we've done the bioregional mapping to create these different bioregional frameworks, we need to rethink about how we're working together and how we're coming together to really rethink governance, where we're all empowered to have a say and impact. And these governing bodies don't exist right now. And so we need to actively be creating them. We need to be actively funding them and flowing support into them as well. I also just want to touch on this idea that everything that we're doing, when we do it together, all becomes part of a nested scale of bioregional regeneration and a global map and strategy of strategic regenerative interventions that we can be taking. And so as we're looking at this map, there are a lot of different places where we can take action and where it becomes very important to take action. And you'll notice this is just land cover. I mean, we're totally ignoring the sea and all the rest of it. But even just looking at this map, I'll just say that in Cascadia, we have 7 of the 10 world's largest carbon storing forests in the world, right? And so we in Cascadia have an outsized impact to be able to protect those forests and to keep that carbon in the ground and not in the atmosphere. I'll say that people who live in the Great Lakes are home to 20% of the world's fresh water and an incredible marine ecosystem of a saltwater brack that flows and is responsible for a tremendous amount of life. When I lived in Tunisia, it was really fun that we got to go to Lake Ixchal, which is one of the largest freshwater lakes in North Africa that traditionally has been home to all of these migratory birds between Africa and Europe. The permafrost, right, holds more than twice of all the carbon emitted in the atmosphere is still stored in the permafrost. Amazon rainforest, same thing, right? Ogallala Aquifer is the aquifer that provides water for 1 billion people. And so if we look at it in this context of a global strategy for regenerative interventions, and think about your own home place and what matters and what's important to start thinking holistically too. And we can actually find these little windows where we can hold the things that are important, and have a tremendously outsized impact on helping regenerate not just our own bioregions, but really the planet. And with that, I'll just say, so what's the point of creating these bioregional maps? I would also add that it's just to create these bioregional networks. Bioregionalism is really rooted on interdependence, not independence. And so it really is both not just how our own landscapes are integrated, but it's also about how are we integrated with all of the other bioregions, of migratory animals, people, of humans, of culture, and how are we coming in right relationship and really talking about these relationships in terms of healing. And you'll see that as part of the strategy then that's reflected in the design school for regenerating Earth, with the Earth Regeneration Fund that's being built, with how people are starting to build these bioregional financing facilities and flow funding, and with all of that. And with all of that, I would also just like to highlight a little bit then of how we've done this in Cascadia. So Regenerate Cascadia started in October of 2023. I mean, which is kind of incredible to think about. It hasn't even been 2 years yet, but it started through a bioregional activation tour, planned and organized with 80 people, and then launched with about 140 people after that. And at each one of these stops, we used this as a cheap excuse to get people together with local organizers, and really challenge and ask people, what would it take to regenerate a watershed? What would it take to regenerate a bioregion? From that, we lifted up the lens and then invited people to come together for a summit, for an online summit, and kind of unconference to then, so that people got to visualize their work to each other, people got to share, and then really launch and start these conversations. And it was such a cool kind of starting place and framework. We use different nested scales of both within a landscape, and for us, a landscape is at least one watershed, but it could be many more, but whatever it makes sense to call home. Within a landscape would be the site where you live, up through our larger ecoregions like the Willamette Valley or Salish Sea, up through our bioregion and globe. And what we're trying to do is both pair the grassroots organizing happening on the ground with building a fund in the back end that starts to flow funding down. And again, in that nested scale of, from planet to bioregion, and into the landscape that sees people supported. We're trying to figure out how we talk about things like governance, how we can talk about topic-based guilds that weave people together by passion or interest, and then also hubs in the landscape. And so these are all things that we're kind of working towards. And we've been doing that through starting to think about things through this learning journey and inviting people in as an introductory thing to learn and start that process of unlearning, with the idea of starting to form seed groups and landscape groups and hubs. And all of this will lead into a hub cultivator that we do later this year, where we'll actually invite people into a year-long, up to 10 landscapes, we'll invite into a year-long process where we start to talk about the story of place and how we help landscapes develop that story. And that will all start with bioregional mapping and an in-person weekend bioregional mapping workshop, building the regeneration strategy, building the budget of what needs to be supported, and then fitting into this broader picture of the kind of the BioFi. How do we start to fund it? How do we build the funding ecosystem? And how do we start to actually see teams getting paid to do this? And then within that, how are we starting to grow governance from these groups for the BioFi and how we're sharing all this together? And so with that, I'll just end there and say thank you. And I would love to maybe just open up the conversation at this point, to whatever you'd like to do. I'd love to invite people also to share where they're coming from. I'd like to learn a little bit more about the bioregions you all call home too. So with that, I'll stop sharing the screen. And I guess we have about 15 minutes. So yeah, I would love to just open it up to the community.
Hi, Bren. I'm not sure how to raise my hand if I can do that. But I was just wondering, the last slides you saw, and thanks, by the way, for these sessions. They're really valuable and yeah, inspiring. So the process you outlined just before, did that involve like different groups doing the bioregional mapping several times, or like for different locations, and then I don't know, I suppose connected into the larger, somehow connecting to the larger bioregional map, or yeah, could you elaborate on that, or maybe I missed it?
Yeah, no, okay, that's a great question. Yeah, actually, I mean, so what's interesting is I think this idea of bioregional mapping has really been growing in this area for many decades. And it started with different First Nations in British Columbia. Um, there was a professor at UBC, Doug Aberley. And so basically since the 1980s, there's been a lot of mapping for both the Salish Sea as an area between Canada and the United States, and then also Cascadia as a bioregion. And so within that, then I think that there's a lot of people exploring, but what actually matters to the people living here, to different communities in different places. And a lot of different people have developed different maps for that. So that's probably fairly vague, but I hope it was helpful. But Will.
Hey, thank you. Well, I've had internet issues and I got distracted. I don't remember what my question was. I do want to give you like a shout out. Y'all give me hope and inspiration, and it's nice to not try to make it up as we go along, you know, a model. So anyway, just kudos.
Claire.
Yeah, it's very wonderful to hear you presenting this and just holding this well, capacity building as well. And I think what I just wanted to say was just the conditions don't yet exist for some of the for the core teams. Like the mapping is just getting some of the pieces in place and holding enough of the strategy and the picture and the story together. But yeah, I just sort of wondered if you wanted to just speak a little bit about how, like, you can only see so far, which is not very far, but you can get some of the, you can map out what you can, but really each place being so unique, those new things are going to bubble up. Just when you're dealing with complex systems, like these are useful tools and that there are conditions that are being created. I don't know if you would like to speak a bit about that or.
No, I think that's really interesting. And with that, I might just add, there's been a lot of learning, and it really is about, I think we're creating a different conversation. And so a lot of what we're doing is actually creating these moments which can shift people's thinking, people's frameworks, shift the conversation out of these old systems, and really create the conditions that don't currently exist, but that we really do need. And so yeah, I mean, especially when we start to talk about bioregional finance and funding, we're talking about it in such a different way. There's a tremendous amount of education that needs to happen for funders, but it's the same also for organizers and for our communities, in that we're so trained into these little boxes and the way of doing business. And honestly, I mean, like really, like in a system that has pitted us against each other for our survival in a scarcity mindset. We need to dramatically reframe and rethink how we're working together. And so almost what we're doing is creating the conditions where these things can actually emerge or bubble up. Or, when you talk about the tipping point with the Malcolm Gladwell, right? Like we want to create these very specific tipping point events that change the way that people think. And that can be done. I mean, a lot of times through like we can change our mindsets because you know, we oftentimes listen to those who we trust, our families, our friends. But also when we can get into these spaces with friends and communities where we're all leaned in, it can actually have very powerful impact and ability for for people to pivot. And I think with these bioregional mapping workshops, you know, they can be done online, but actually they're best in person with a community. And what's really cool is that the process of mapping might not even change that much, but who's in the room will dramatically change your outcome. So if it's a small group of 3 people with one organization, it can be a very powerful exercise and a really cool outcome. But your outcome's going to be very different if you have a community invitation that brings together members of 20 different organizations all within a watershed, or different, you know, includes indigenous voices or voices of communities that are traditionally left out, or, you know, are including voices of some of the largest impactors. And inviting in each of those different elements is going to dramatically change your outcome and give us a better picture of the places that we live and the communities that we live in. So yeah, thank you. Karen, over to you.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of branding and how people have used the concepts of regeneration or local food, or, you know, they'll take something that meant something to me, and then they, you know, might capture that meaning and reframe it into an extractive and commodification framework right out from under my nose. And I've done this where, like, I've bought food at the grocery store that says something like fresh local farm, you know, baked local or something. And then when I look at the back of it, I was like, oh, that's the name of the product. It doesn't have anything to do with being actually, you know, baked local or something. So what I've been focusing on is how do we like create, or one of the things I'm focusing on is like, how do we create text-based agreements among ourselves that are transparent, that are ways of us pointing to an ethical code, a system of values that we share, and we're all going to agree to share that, and make that visible to people who aren't yet bought into this new paradigm, so that they can recognize in themselves that, oh, okay, you know, there's a group of, I'll put it in consumer language, right? There's a group of consumers who are interested in plastic-free restaurant options in the city of Milwaukee. And all I need to do to be recognizable and findable to people who want to consume that way is to agree to reduce my, you know, single-use plastic usage. And they're going to actually, the Plastic-Free Milwaukee is actually going to help me to access different kinds of packaging, or, you know, we're going to design a regional reuse and rinse system and stuff like that. So I find that the permaculture principles provide a compelling framework for evaluating and storytelling about like climate forward and collapse inclusive planning and design, from that scale of the watershed to the soil and things like that. And so I'm trying to use mapping to help people, you know, find things that are truly relational, that aren't just using this language to try to, you know, capture more dollars without being in an accountable way, and then to make it easier for people who want to be accountable and relational to be findable to people who care about that.
Wow, yeah. I think everything you just said is so important and powerful. And this idea of community agreements. And I think this gets really important when you're working with indigenous communities as well. And it's why in the first couple sessions, I really talked a lot about this importance of acknowledgement, attribution, reciprocity, um, and honestly lineage. And these are like all foundational for when we're talking about building networks of trust and these trust-based networks. I think what we're talking about is building in, how do we build in a North Star, shared values, so that we know that the people that we're working with, like that we are all in the working, using the same language. We have the same meaning of the language that we use when we say regenerative. And so what are those principles and values? And that's really cool, because it is this idea too that, well, we are creating a regenerative space. We still live in an extractive system. There are still a lot of people working to survive and who will pull from it. And so, and you have a lot of communities that have been taken advantage of for a long time. And so that becomes just very important. So, and I also think it's a fun way that you can be, there's other people who have been a little bit sneaky about it. Like one of my favorite examples of someone creating bioregional maps is Sanctuary Earth, and they're creating maps of bioregions, but then attached to every one of it, and they'll make a map for people, but then they'll attach a little thing that just says, the mission of our bioregional framework is 50% biodiversity restoration from, to back to pre-settlement levels. And what's powerful about that sentence is that it sounds so simple, right? Like, oh yeah, we could restore 50% of our biodiversity back to pre-contact levels. But actually, that's a very radical thing. It would actually take a huge shift to bring us back, because people don't realize how far gone a lot of our ecosystem health is. But what's really cool too is it also sets a framework for what do we need to map. Well, if we want to know that, we also need to know what was the biodiversity and of North America, pre-human contact or pre-settler contact. And that's a really cool exploration that even starts that conversation, as well as setting up our MRV or bioregional carrying or context-based indicators for what that might be now. So Marie, over to you, and then I think we'll wrap up.
You're muted.
Yeah, about all the different cultures and the boundaries and everything that prevents the bioregional new vision now to come into place. And I suddenly thought of the things that do connect or cross. So I thought of religion straight away, because the death of the Pope meant that a huge amount of Catholic churches kind of connected all around the planet. I went to Notre Dame myself, and then I was amazed that my post was viewed in Brazil by loads of people. So the second thing that came to mind was the Dam and Her Federation. I just put the names in the chat there, the Dam and Her Federation, because they have worked into making a map of synchronic lines, what they call the synchronic line, the lines of energy. Suppose it relates to ley lines and such concepts of energetic lines of the planet. So I just also brought up the book that you can find. It's called The Synchronic Lines by Falco Tarasaku, The Energy Streams of Planet Earth. I just wanted to bring this up because I thought that'd be a way to look at the connectivity of all the bioregional places through this spiritual energetic map that would correspond to the energies of the planet. There you go.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing, and thank you, everybody. I will just say, yeah, so I think that's it for our first 3 sessions, and I apologize for the break, but I'm just going to be heads down. We're doing a Cascadia BioFi conference in about 3 weeks, and so it's kind of just all hands on deck through that. But stay tuned for further updates. And then also anybody who filled out that sheet, I think as soon as there's capacity and time, we'll probably start reaching out with one-on-one just to start getting some conversation started about those next steps. And then we'll come back and we'll do another 3 sessions at some point that'll probably be more focused on types of maps, GIS, and then also more sharing of different people's actual bioregions and bioregional frameworks that they really want to explore, different layers of stewardship. So thank you, everybody. It's been wonderful, and have a great week. And do stay connected in the bioregional mapping area of the Design School for Regenerating Earth, and whatever other communities of practices you're in. Share any resources that you'd like, or anything that you've done that you think is awesome. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Brad.